I would like to welcome all of you, ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists and dear guests. My name is Jan Voska. I work as a cultural attaché at the Embassy of Czech Republic. And on behalf of the Embassy and the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I would like to welcome you today at the panel discussion to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So again, thank you so much for joining us and being here with us today. I would like to offer a very special warm welcome to our three distinguished guests and panelists, Tom Dine, Jamie Fly, and Tomáš Etzler, who all will be introduced shortly. Before I turn it over to Tomáš, who will moderate today's discussion and introduce Tom and Jamie, I want to go through some very basic housekeeping rules with you. We have 1 hour for our discussion, and we promise we will save at least 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. Please post your questions anytime, even now, for our guests in Q&A box in the bottom center of your Zoom screen. Don't type your questions into the chat, as this is the channel for us to communicate with the panelists. Lastly, our discussion is going to be recorded, so we can provide opportunity to see it to everyone who could not make it today. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Tomáš Etzler. Tomáš is a television journalist, scriptwriter, and dramaturg with over 20 years of professional experience. As a correspondent and producer for CNN and the Czech television, he worked in over 60 countries on 5 continents. He covered war in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as conflicts in Haiti and Lebanon. His work has been featured on ITN, Channel 4, BBC Radio, and in the Czech press. He has received numerous international awards, including an Emmy Award in 2008. With this, Tomáš, I turn it over to you, and I wish everyone a very pleasant debate.
Jan, thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody from the mountains in the northern Czech Republic. Good morning to you in the United States. I would like to very briefly introduce two our guests today. One already mentioned is Tom Dine, who is a president of American Friends of the Czech Republic. And the second is Jamie Fly, a senior fellow and senior advisor to the president of the German Marshall Fund. Good morning, gentlemen, to Washington.
Good morning to you, Tomáš.
You know, I don't want to talk to you about your credentials. Why don't you tell me? Tom, can you please tell me a little bit more? I should probably mention also that both of the gentlemen, both of my guests, were at some time presidents or CEOs of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Tom, tell me a little bit more. What was your involvement with Radio Free Europe, and what is American Friends of the Czech Republic? What do you do?
First of all, I have a mixed record when it comes to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. In the 1970s, yes, I was working for U.S. Senator Frank Church, a Democrat of Idaho, and a scandal broke out in the United States about CIA funding of student groups and other associations, civil associations, and one of which it was revealed was Radio Free Europe. And although this was a well-known secret, when it became part of the public domain, several US senators moved to kill Radio Free Europe forever. And I worked for one of those senators, Church, and I wrote his speech to kill Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And then many years later, I became the president over the most glorious 9 years of my life. So I live with that contradiction. Having said that, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's mission is to promote and articulate democratic values and institutions through the means of news reporting. And those means are critical to any democracy. In fact, it follows one of the rallying cries of Radio Free Europe. I consider there were two. One by de Tocqueville, the French intellectual of the 19th century, who wrote that the most important, indeed, the essential ingredient of liberty is a free press. the other rallying cry of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, which talks about the freedom across borders, that you can't stop the truth and news and information being spread across the world. And one of the key expressions in Article 19 is regardless of frontiers. So Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty practices democracy, practices free journalism, free expression. And when I was president, we were in 22 countries speaking 28 different languages every day in reporting the local news, and then some international. But Jamie can talk about how it was expanded more under him.
We will go back. We will definitely get to it. But can you tell me who are American Friends of Czech Republic?
Sorry, I got so involved in Radio Free Europe. American Friends of the Czech Republic is a nonprofit nationwide advocacy group that again came about because of conditions. And in 1985, whenever the NATO expanded, there were four places that NATO expanded into: Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. And each of these four countries had their advocacy groups in the United States. The Czechs didn't, and that became the rallying cry for those of Czech origin, because the organization was founded by those with Czech origins heritage, to lobby Congress for admittance of the Czech Republic into NATO. And so that was its beginning, and now it is a advocacy group that fosters interchanges between the parliamentarians in Prague and Congress, and congressmen going to the Czech Republic and learning about the functioning of parliament there. There are other programs that the group sponsors and participates in, and it's going to expand in the near future into more scientific exchanges as well as business exchanges.
Jamie, you work as a senior fellow for the German Marshall Fund. What is it and what do you do?
Great to be with both of you, to see Tom, and to be with you, Tomáš, for this conversation. And thanks to the embassy for bringing us all together. So I'm at the German Marshall Fund. I'm currently based in Berlin, where the German Marshall Fund has one of its offices. It's a transatlantic think tank and an organization that promotes transatlantic cooperation. And so I do traditional think tank work, write, speak about a variety of topics.
Tom, you mentioned a little bit about the mission and the purpose of Radio Free Europe. But let's talk briefly about the history. We are now celebrating the 70th, or you are celebrating 70th anniversary. How did it evolve? And what were the biggest milestones in the history? If you can briefly tell us.
Like all organs, the biggest milestone was its beginning, and its beginning, interestingly, particularly with Jan being our host and organizer this morning, the first broadcast of just Radio Free Europe was in late 1959 off a truck in Germany into Czechoslovakia, communist Czechoslovakia. And so the first broadcast was to a country that I grew to love in terms of living in Prague for 9 years. So that's its origin. There were two organizations, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Radio Liberty were broadcasts to the Soviet Union per se, and the Radio Free Europe was to the countries of Central Europe, that eventually those two organs were merged into Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Europe. So that's the beginning. As I mentioned already, a turning point was 1973 with the revelation that the CIA was funding these broadcasts, and that was changed into private hands with the backing of the United States government. And since then, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has been funded as a contractor of the United States government. Unlike Voice of America, which is a US government organ, and those people receive the traditional green checks of the United States government, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is private, but operates on a contract with the US government. When the organization, when the Cold War ended, there were musings in Washington about this is just a relic of the Cold War. We ought to get rid of it. And frankly, President Clinton was one of those. And he moved to end the existence of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which was countered by a young upstart senator named Joe Biden. And Joe Biden became almost like the second father of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in his younger senatorial days. And finally, Biden had to work around a liberal Democrat, Senator Feingold of Wisconsin, and a conservative Republican named Jesse Helms in North Carolina. And they worked out a compromise in which Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty would have would only last until midnight of January 1st, 1999. That's when I was hired because of my knowledge of Capitol Hill. I was hired in 1997, and my job was to overcome that legislation and that sunset that was forthcoming in New Year's Eve. And I did that in less than a year and a half. I worked with Congress to make Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in the legislation. It says the continuing mission of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and it's still ongoing. So that was a big moment. Finally, the next biggest moment was moving the whole operation from Munich, the Cold War location, to Prague at the invitation of President Havel. So President Havel is another father of the modern Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and he told President Clinton, "Cut it out." I'm told it was a sort of a tough conversation over the telephone. Cut it out, and we're going to host Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague, and we're going to put the radios, ironically, in the former Communist Parliament building at the top of Wenceslas Square. So interestingly, that became the next phase of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. It got a new building after the 9/11 attacks, in which the Czechs wanted us in a safer location, and we moved. So it's had different iterations, but always the same mission. And I think I started in order to save the radios in terms of legislation. I was scratching my head. How can I do this? And one day I happened to be in Washington, and I was reading the morning Washington Post, and above the fold of the front page, it said something about Iran and Iraq. And I said, that's it. We're going to do just like NATO. We're going to go out of area. We're going to go to Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. And since then we've been broadcasting, and then successors went to Pakistan, and Jamie did his thing.
We will get to Jamie. Please tell me. We've heard this is a private entity. You know, I used to work for private television such as CNN, and also for the public broadcaster, the Czech television. But tell us a little bit about the structure. You know, how is Radio Free Europe structured? Who is on the top? Is there some sort of supervising body, or who is supervising it? If there is a supervision, can you tell us a little bit about the structure, how this organization is structured?
Sure. We could probably talk for the entire hour about the structure, because the structure has evolved over time. It's actually currently.
I meet you in the elevator. I give you 3 minutes to explain to before we reach the top.
Yeah, I think the principle, and Tom did a good job describing the efforts to save the radios. And the principle, as far as I can tell, ever since Congress wanted to fund U.S. international broadcasting, of which RFERL is part, overtly, so outside of the CIA structure, is they wanted to make sure that the radios had an arm's length relationship with the federal government. Even though the federal government, ultimately, Congress appropriates the funding each year, they wanted to make sure that the State Department or other parts of the U.S. federal government were not telling the radios what stories to cover, how to cover them, that they were able to function with the independence of a normal a newsroom like those that we see at major news organizations in Western countries. And so the structure has always started off with that foundational principle. The way that independence has been preserved has changed over time. There's been boards, there's been the radio's reporting up through certain agencies, State Department at one point, independent agencies, which is the current structure. But all of those structures have always been with the goal of preserving editorial independence. And so there was a board, a federal board. There's now a federal CEO. The radio still has a corporate board, which is supposed to help guarantee its independence. And then it's always led by a president and CEO who really acts as the publisher. I always saw it in my brief 11 months there as really helping to be that second test of the so-called editorial firewall, and making sure that the journalists did not get pressure from anyone in the US government, even from members of Congress, about what to cover and how to cover it. And so that throughout, ever since the 1970s, change in the funding, I think, has been preserved.
Thank you, Jamie. I've got another question. Actually, it's kind of for both of you, but I would like to hear first from Jamie. Tom explained a little bit the needs, why this station was established, but he also mentioned the fall of communism. That the purpose, the whole idea, who to serve, what countries to address, was changed. So tell me, what is the focus of what regions are the main focus of the Radio Free Europe now, and why? Jamie.
Yeah, a lot of the countries are still the same that the radios were operating in during the Cold War. So basically, it's the post-Soviet space with several additional countries in Central Europe now that I can talk in a bit about RFERL returning to. But as Tom noted, in recent decades, we also expanded to places like Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan. So it was a large swath of Eurasia, and it's an important region, obviously, even despite the fact that you don't have the communist challenge in the same way. But think about this region. It's a region where China is growing in influence, where Russia still is very influential across many countries in the region. A lot of these countries are not democracies, or if they are democracies, they're fledgling democracies, where there aren't a lot of other independent media outlets that are able to survive, either because of market pressure or government pressure. And so RFERL, true to its original mission, plays a key role of being that first foot in the door to prop open the media space in many countries across the region and provide truly independent and objective news and information to the populations of what is still an incredibly important region.
So, Tomáš, can I ask? I'd like to add to that. Jamie just talked about foot in the door, but it's also what you do with those feet when you get inside the door. And one of the thrills I had was when we came up with the Uzbek service, came up with a program to tell their listeners, again locally, how to deal with the police or government officials who are trying to order them around and to behave as if it were still Soviet times. And it came up with a program called Know Your Rights, Know Your Legal Rights, know how to deal with those if you're accosted on the streets by a policeman. And that became a very widely listened to radio program because it gave the listeners information on how to deal with the rough stuff, the repressive kind of stuff that still lingers, as Jamie emphasized.
I want to ask you about another thing is like what you mentioned, you are in those countries. Now you were in former Eastern Bloc before. I'm sure that you've faced criticism or attacks from the leaders of those countries or from the politicians and maybe even the citizens of those countries who are loyal to the government, that you are a branch, you are a propaganda branch of American government, that you work for the American government. How do you counter this sort of accusations or attacks? What do you say to these people?
Well, I think Jamie and I may have some different examples, but number one, you got to be true to yourself. You got to be true to the ethos, to the values that of which is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's mission, to promote and articulate democratic values. So that gets into, well, what's the information you're broadcasting or projecting? And it has to be based on at least two sources. It can't be what comes from the local government and just reiterate what the local government wants you to say. It has to be based on what's the information you have, and it's called the two-source rule. And of course, even more sources are always welcome. So there's objective journalism. It has to be honest, has to be accurate, has to be two-sourced, has to be local, and it has to be in the context of democracy. Now, I'll give you one other example, then we'll listen to Jamie. During my period was the crisis in the Clinton White House about his dalliance with a particular young lady. And we decided that this was a rule of law issue, not a purple dress, blue dress, or just a scandal. This was about the rule of law, and that Clinton, under those circumstances, would have to deal with this issue within that scope. So we had an opportunity to, again, articulate our value, one of which is the rule of law, and it worked very well. It worked very well, and we kept our credibility, as Jamie said, our independence, and I would add to that, with independence comes credibility, and that was a good moment for us.
Jamie, your take on it, because I want to just kind of tell you, when I was, for example, in early 2000s, when I was in the Middle East working for CNN, I was accused by the local authorities or even by some local people that the CNN is part of CIA. We had to defend ourselves. In China, I was, my translators, my Chinese colleagues were told, their families were called by the Chinese secret police that I work for CIA, I work for other intelligence agencies. How do you counter that? Your take on it, please, Jamie.
I think Tom hit on it. I mean, the key there is the quality and the independence of our journalism. I think the audiences just need to look at what our language services are putting out on a daily basis, and they can come to their own conclusions. And what we've seen over decades is that our audiences are usually incredibly loyal. It's increasingly difficult to find loyal audiences in the digital age, where people have so many options, in especially online, to get news and information. But the radios have always attracted a loyal following, and people come to listen or read our content because they trust us and they understand that this is not official US policy that the radios are putting out, but it's independent and objective. When I got pressed on this by authoritarian or semi-authoritarian leaders, my first response was always, well, why don't you do an interview with us? I mean, one thing we do in terms of getting our foot in the door and modeling an independent press is we want to interview government officials. Now, a lot of these regimes didn't like our coverage, and so they wouldn't ever appear on one of our shows. But that was one of my goals as president, was I always was trying to get our journalists greater access, allow them to attend press conferences, get them interviews with high-level officials. So that was one response I often had. And the other thing I should note is, of course, governments, given that we are congressionally funded, would try to complain to the US government, to the State Department. My experience at RFERL was that for the most part, the State Department officials, they know to not even bother coming to the radios with those complaints. They know to tell those foreign officials, look, we have no control over them. They're truly independent. And obviously that, I think, helps reinforce our objectivity, our independence, if US government officials make very clear to their foreign interlocutors that this is not some higher level US policy that is being driven through the radios on a daily basis.
But Tomáš, if I could interject again, some of the critics during my time were actually American ambassadors, and they didn't like some of our programs in the countries to which they were accredited because it didn't complement the ministers they were cultivating. And I got more phone calls from the field, that is American embassies, than I did from State Department officials. But the phone call, there was a pattern to the phone calls, which was, you just criticized Minister X or Minister Y, and here the US government has just paid for the paving of a road in front of his house. That was one example, and I won't tell you the names because it's so embarrassing. But everybody's got an angle to this dangle, and you got to be careful, and you have to be truthful.
Thank you very much. Before I ask another question, I just want to remind our viewers that this is an interactive debate. If you have any questions, you can post them. I already see some. I will ask them in the second half of the program. I go back to you, gentlemen. Now, I want to ask one thing. I can imagine that collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism in Europe was a big challenge for Radio Free Europe. It had to kind of reinvent itself, and what have you. But I do have some experiences with Radio Free Europe in Prague and in Kiev, and I see that, or I believe that the Radio Free Europe is facing another huge kind of a milestone, and it is basically how to remain relevant. Also, there is another thing is, within our lives, within the last 10 years, the broadcasting technologies, news gathering technologies changed tremendously, changed the industry. Tell me, you started and for decades, Radio Free Europe were a radio. Today, it's a television. Today, there is social media. There is so many new channels of distribution. How do you react to these changes, technological changes? How do you remain relevant? How do you compete with what's out there? Jamie.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Just one brief comment first on the post-'89 evolution. I think it's incredibly important just to note that after 1989, RFERL, the two radios, which had operated from Munich, mostly remotely, were not, for the most part, able to be in country on the ground. They were able to rely on some reports occasionally from the ground, but not to have formal bureaus in the countries that they were reporting on and broadcasting to. That all changed. And so RFERL was able to start going out in the field, which really, I think, shaped the modern RFERL, which is a journalistic news organization that's on the ground, side by side with its audience in as many countries as possible. It's not always possible because of some of the government pressure, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and we sometimes get kicked out and have to close bureaus. But that differentiates just the geographic reach of RFERL's now 20 bureaus, and that's important. And then the move to Prague, which Tom mentioned, I really think, I always told our staff, I think that move gave the organization new life, a new spirit. Havel certainly, as maybe the third father of RFERL, half of the staff at headquarters are Czech. Many of them lived through the communist era. I think their personal experiences to this day have shaped their passions, certainly for their work, but also the culture of the institution. And that's been incredibly important in the last several decades. The transformation has been huge, as you've noted, in the news organization in news organizations generally. Transition from radio to TV, RFERL has gone through that transition. I think the radio to TV transition was the most difficult, just given some of the cultural changes of radio journalists versus TV journalists. The digital transformation is the one that's really underway now. It started a number of years ago, but RFERL is on the leading edge of every relevant social media platform in every market it's in. We have a growing number of people who are digital specialists in those markets, putting out content online on a daily basis. And in some countries where our access is restricted because of governments that don't want us to be able to broadcast or get on satellite packages, digital is the primary platform on which we can engage people. And sometimes it's only a handful of social media platforms that are even allowed in a particular country. So I think the company has adapted to all of these transitions. But the one aspect that concerns me most, and I think it's not just an RFERL concern, it's every news organization is struggling with this. As I mentioned before, RFERL has always been marked by its credibility, by the brand loyalty with its audience, and credibility is being attacked online. I mean, people tend to consume news not based on brand loyalty anymore. They just kind of, whatever shows up in their news feed, if it's been shared by a friend or by someone they trust. And so that brand loyalty has really been diminished, and it's making it difficult for all news organizations, I think, to find their footing in the digital space. I still think even online, we are able to draw a particular audience that knows us, that appreciates our independence and objectivity. But that is a challenge that I think our digital teams in particular are grappling with on a daily basis at RFERL.
And I agree with Jamie on everything he said. I would add the following. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty faces the same challenge that public broadcasting in this country faces. You get audiences that only want to hear what they already know or already think, and just want to be reinforced. And that's where cable news comes in. Having said that, I think Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is like public broadcasting. The word objective comes up over and over again. It's not slanted news. It's not partisan news. It is based on what is. And take the news hour. I watch it, for instance, because I want to know what the balanced approach is to something that is happening today and has happened. And Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty does the same thing. It is true to itself, and it knows it has a fairly well-educated audience, if not a very well-educated audience, and it has to produce information that is relevant to the individual on the ground. And from that perspective, then there's what I call a faith that people with information will make their own decisions and make the right decisions for whatever purpose.
I think that said, all this, going into video broadcasting, television, going digital, going on social media, but you still have to maintain being a radio too. Is that correct? Because, I can imagine that a lot of your audiences in Iran, in Afghanistan, actually don't have the access to internet or it's blocked. They still, I believe, rely on radio. Is that correct?
Well, for sure, during my time, there was even a transformation in terms of radio, that is from shortwave, which I try to get away from, and get affiliated with local FM stations. FM, after the fall of communism, FM became the way people did receive their information, particularly as more and more people purchased cars and listened to radio in the morning and in the evening, just like the listening that goes on in Western Europe and the United States. So FM affiliation with FM stations in all these different countries is the best way to get your news and commentary out.
Yeah, we're still doing a lot of radio in a number of those markets like Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan. It was interesting during my time at RFERL. It's partly a generational issue in certain countries. I would often get asked when I went to visit our bureaus and I talked to some of our audience, In some countries, people wanted us to come back on radio where we had left. There was this, especially amongst an older generation, a desire to kind of go back to the days where they remember sitting around the radio with their family, listening to one of our precursor services. And there was a certain romanticism about that era that people were upset that they couldn't experience anymore in some countries. The other thing we use radio for, and I think even after I left, this just happened a number of months ago, sometimes during a crisis, during a moment when governments cut internet access, they restrict certain platforms. Radio is sometimes the only way that you can still reach your audience. And I think in Belarus, which has obviously been racked by protests, RFERL went back up on radio a few hours a day as a temporary measure. So yes, radio is still very much one of the platforms that's being used, but the transition is obviously increasingly to a digital delivery method.
And that's how we went into Iran. We started with shortwave and then to FM into Iran, but the Iranians are so digitally oriented, it's so social media oriented that we early on in our broadcast to Iran had to be shrewd and facile with the way we got our news disseminated.
You know, all these things we've mentioned, you know, like starting with, I think what Jamie said is that you are opening the bureaus now. You have foot on the ground in Russia, in Kiev, in Afghanistan, in other countries, digitalization, video. Video, for example, is more complicated. It demands more skill and it's more expensive than radio. Is there enough political, and you are a non-profit organization, you don't broadcast commercials, you don't have subscribers. Is there enough political will in current United States to maintain this organization, to keep funding this organization? Can you tell me a little bit about this and what are the challenges on this field?
Any program in the United States that requires legislation, that is, in this case, an annual appropriations that gets then disseminated to its different groups, always has to be worked on. And there's always questioning from legislators on the value of this or that, in this case, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And even though I am no longer associated with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I wonder Capitol Hill at times. I talk with different legislators off the Hill and always bring up Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And it gets back to Jamie's point about a brand. And your point, Tomáš, that as long as the Russians are misbehaving, are troublemakers in the world, particularly vis-a-vis the West, and that means really the United States, as long as the Chinese are a growing power and a growing irritant to Western ways and Western values, there will be interest in these international broadcasting. And so the more trouble there is, the more support there is for Radio Free Europe.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's my experience, and I actually, my path to the radio is actually also began on Capitol Hill as a Senate staffer when I was involved in doing some oversight of U.S. international broadcasting. There's always been strong bipartisan support in recent decades for RFERL. I think the challenge that we face now, there's a recognition that the U.S. needs to do more in the information space through formal U.S. public diplomacy efforts, through the State Department, probably more support for U.S. international broadcasting. But there's a real debate emerging about the goals and what are we actually trying to achieve? How much of what we do should be focused on telling our story to the world, the traditional VOA, a Voice of America mission, explaining American policy to the world, versus what RFERL and the other surrogate networks do, which is, as we've described, really helping to build out that independent media space. I believe the United States needs to figure out how to do both. And I passionately believe that what RFERL is doing is incredibly important given the tactics of the countries that Tom mentioned, the authoritarians who are acting in this space, who are trying to degrade truth, spread conspiracy theories, all of those problems are really fester and become much more difficult to tackle if you don't have independent media. And that's really where RFERL plays such an important role. So I think the congressional support will be there in the future. But this period we're going through right now, I think there's a real debate about kind of how the different tools should be structured and prioritized. And I'm sure that'll continue into the new administration that's coming in next month.
During the Cold War, Tomáš, there was a complement of international broadcasters: BBC, the French Internationale, Deutsche Welle, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And those 5 radios had the most impact of all. You could single out each one's listening audience, but together was a thrust of Western values, Western activities that the audiences wanted. And I think you put those together today, and you get the same kind of impact.
With that, I will move to the questions from our viewers. The first is, in recent years, pro-democracy movements and anti-authoritarian protests have relied more on quick communications and information gathering over the internet and social media. Has Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty been able to reach these audiences in nations with a limited or censored internet, but where utilization of radio communications may be less prominent than in previous decades?
Yeah, there have been many cases, even just in the last year or two, of RFERL being right in the middle of protest coverage. I mean, protests in Moscow over the course of a number of weeks of the summer that I began at RFERL, in the Far East in Russia, Belarus most recently with the Belarusian service there. On the ground, a number of its reporters even getting jailed in the process and denied accreditation because of their coverage. So yeah, RFERL often provides that sort of coverage because the state-funded outlets in those countries shy away from actually reporting what's going on. The questioner asked an important point, or raises an important point though, about when the internet gets shut down or when governments really try to restrict access then to the platforms that RFERL are using. It's incredibly difficult to reach them. I've found that most of our language services were quite adaptable. They were able to come up with short-term fixes, workarounds. You sometimes can't have the same reach that you could through your traditional means of access. But as part of U.S. international broadcasting, the U.S. Congress has also set up an organization called the Open Technology Fund. And I believe it's funded roughly $20 million a year right now, in part to help provide solutions both to the broadcasters as well as activists and others outside of the US government who want to communicate securely, who want to be able to access content despite these firewalls that we see more and more authoritarians using. But that's an area that needs a lot more support, a lot more research, because what we found is the authoritarians have become very adaptable, and they're constantly looking at what works, how to block access on certain platforms, and that I assume that problem's going to continue in the years to come.
Interestingly, two recent examples of what Jamie just mentioned. Number one is Hungary. Supposedly a member of NATO, member of the European Union, and with a authoritarian-prone government under Orban, who used to visit me in my Radio Free Europe office and plead and tell me what a great Democrat, small d, he was. But in fact, he is controlling news through government agencies more and more, and therefore Radio Free Europe, I think, made the right decision to go back in to Hungary, where it stopped broadcasting, and to provide as much information as possible that, again, is objective. Secondly is the recent Nagorno-Karabakh crisis between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan hates Radio Free Europe because it's led by an authoritarian first father and now son, and it controls the media. And Armenia has always had a mixed view of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, depending on how much influence Russia has over it, over its activities. So again, events will help Radio Free Europe. And in this case, crises. And nothing is better than an objective news collection and news broadcasting organization.
Tom partially hit on one of the questions here. It's a question from Robert Hutchins. How should the West deal with the reversals of democracy in at least two of its original broadcast countries, Hungary and Poland? If NATO and EU are to thrive, they must deal effectively with the fact that their core values are no longer embraced by the governments of these countries. So how do you deal with it?
This was a very important topic during my tenure at RFERL, because we had just shortly before I arrived returned to Romania and Bulgaria with small digital-only services, and I was tasked by our board at the time to plan for the return to Hungary, which just happened a few months after I left, with also a digital-only service, and Tom talked about that a little bit. I think that RFERL can play a role in helping to, again, have the foot in the door in the information space to show that the US is concerned about the media situation in that particular country. But I do fear, just given resource issues, given that these markets that we're talking about are, although they've got problems and are increasingly politicized markets, they're very different markets than the ones that RFERL is operating in many other countries. Despite all the problems in Hungary from a media perspective, it's a very different market than Tajikistan in Central Asia, where there really aren't that many independent outlets. There are independent outlets in Hungary. The problem is it's a dwindling number, and they're very politicized, even those that are still able to survive. And so I don't think the US, through US international broadcasting, can solve this problem alone. I would argue that you need more European engagement, maybe more of the European broadcasters to start playing a role in some of these markets. Most of these markets are ones that they had also abandoned for various reasons, mostly financial, sometimes political. And my hope is, honestly, as we move to a new administration, that this sort of thing might be more of a priority for the US Brussels conversation, because I think we need more US-EU cooperation to talk about rule of law, press freedom issues in places like Poland and Hungary. Because unless we're going to suddenly discover more, the Congress is going to discover significant more resources, I think it's really going to be difficult for RFERL alone to have a significant impact in each of these complex media markets. When, in the case of Hungary, for instance, if you look at all of the money that pro-Orban media are spending on an annual basis, it just is incredibly much more significant than anything that RFERL can bring to the table. I think RFERL was spending in 1 year what the pro-Orban media are spending in 1 day, for example. And so there are just some fundamental market challenges there that we're not going to be able to overcome alone, even when we do re-enter, and we need more transatlantic cooperation on this issue.
I've got another question from this part of the world is, what is the relationship between Radio Free Europe and other outlets in the countries in which it is active? Whether national media such as, for example, Radio Prague International or expat sources, the Prague Monitor, are these other outlets viewed as competitors, potential sources of collaborations? How do you view this issue?
I'll start with an introduction. Life is competitive. Of course, these are competitors, but at the same time, they're like-minded in the sense of shared values. Prague International is a terrific organization, but it doesn't always broadcast to the same places that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty does. And therefore, information is shared, there's interactions, people hire and then fire people in these places, and depending on what your needs are, etc. So they're companions, they're collaborators, and they're competitors.
Sure, I agree. I think in many markets, sure, we're when we have other independent outlets, we're competitive with them. However, in some of the more restrictive markets, I think a lot of our competitors really look to us for leadership, just because RFERL traditionally has been more forward-leaning, able to take greater risks in some markets. On my first trip as president, I actually went to Tajikistan, very restrictive media environment. I met with a journalist from another outlet who I guess would be deemed a competitor. And he testified to me the importance of our mere presence in Tajikistan as opening up more space for these other competitors, because we were able to do hard-hitting, investigative, political reporting. The comment he made to me is, because you can report on A, B, and C, we in the other media can at least report fact A. We can say, you know, RFERL, or in the case of Tajikistan, Radio Ozadi, they reported A, and so we maybe won't get as much pressure because we're reporting on what you're reporting. And so I think we play a kind of symbiotic role in some of those most restrictive markets, while at the same time, we're obviously competing for audience and also sometimes competing for staff.
Tomáš, and this gets back to an earlier point, the role of Václav Havel, Czechoslovakia, then the Czech Republic's first president in non-communist conditions. He had a strategy. He had a pro-West strategy. Get the Czech Republic into NATO. Get the Czech Republic into the EU. Bring in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. These were his three avenues to Westernization, to anti-communism, if you will, in the modern era. And from your question, I would derive that we're playing the role he wanted us to play.
I will move to another question. We already, I think, partly touched on it with regards, you know, when we're talking about digitalization and what have you. Do you think U.S. international broadcasting needs to be revitalized, like what is being proposed for the U.S. Foreign Service?
What's been proposed for the U.S. Foreign Service?
I've been looking into this a little bit. I assume that the questioner is referring to a number of the articles and proposals recently to, I mean, some have proposed a global service that's more flexible instead of the U.S. Foreign Service, so people can come in for short-term periods rather than committing their entire career to the U.S. Foreign Service. Honestly, I mean, I think that's a worthy conversation for the State Department's public diplomacy work, and people forget that's an important part of this. I mean, that's not journalism, but I do think the United States should look long and hard, and the new administration should look long and hard at how the United States describes its policies to the world. And I think that's best done by diplomats and public information officers working for the State Department, and also in part through Voice of America. But for RFERL, I mean, I think my experience was we operate like many news organizations. Sometimes it's a bit different in that people flee countries where they're not able to live anymore and work freely, and so they come to Prague and work for RFERL, and they maybe make more of a career of it than they would if they were living in New York or London and kind of moving around from one news organization to another. But we have a lot of people coming at RFERL for a number of years with a particular specialty. And we don't have an overly hierarchical system. I think we have a flexible system, especially when you get out in the bureaus and you look at our journalists in the field. And so I don't know that U.S. international broadcasting on the non-federal side needs the sort of fundamental overhaul that's maybe implied by the question.
I agree.
I've got a couple more questions. I want to ask you, you know, it would be very unfair to ask you, where do you want to see Radio Free Europe in another 70 years? But I will ask you, where do you think, you know, where are you heading? You know, where would you like to see, or what do you think would be the role of Radio Free Europe in 10, 15 years?
I think the need is there. The need for, again, freedom and democracy as the ethos of a broadcasting station is there and will always need to be there. We're in a struggle right now between the post-Soviet, post-Cold War period of when many flowers were going to bloom called democracy, when in fact they haven't. And it's a daily contest between repression, oppressive outfits called governments, versus those that are part of the tradition of the Enlightenment and democratic values. So I think we're going to be relevant over the next 20 years, and I bet you over the next 70 years, although I doubt if I'll be around for that.
Yeah, I agree with Tom. I fear we're going to be relevant for a very long time to come, because honestly, I think in the business that RFERL is in, the goal, instead of restarting services, which I was involved in, we hopefully should eventually be closing some services, as some of our predecessors did at a much more hopeful time. Now, maybe some of that was premature, but I hope we can get back on that trajectory rather than even having to talk about possibly expanding to more and more markets, because that's a bad sign about the state of the world. I mean, I think ultimately, I just hope that the organization stays true to its mission, stays true to its goal of helping to shore up the truth. It's a very Havelian notion. And during my time as president, I talked extensively with the staff about the concept of living in truth. And I think RFERL is an embodiment of that. So I hope we stay true to that mission, no matter which countries RFERL is operating in, and even as the expansion perhaps continues.
Jamie, last thing. At the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned I'm sorry, Tom. I meant Tom and Jamie. I will ask you a similar question. You mentioned, Tom, at the beginning of this conversation that your 8 years with Radio Free Europe was the most glorious years of your professional life. Why?
Because I was living every day in the bed of democracy and freedom fighters and people who had it worse and now wanted to make it better for others. You know, early on in the Cold War period, the post-Cold War period, many of our journalists had not been trained as journalists, but they crawled out from underneath the barbed wire of communism and started a new life themselves. They re-engineered themselves. And I had nothing but the ultimate and respect for them and cared for them and wanted them on our side. And they've performed beautifully. Their biggest problem is once you crawl out from underneath that barbed wire into freedom, you got to retain your currency from where you've come if you're going to broadcast back, and therefore we couldn't tolerate people that had lost the idiom from where they came, and that's what happens to refugees and immigrants. So you're constantly changing your staff, but that should be the worst of all problems. So I lived among freedom fighters.
Jamie, what it meant for you to be president of this organization, you know, for you personally, you know, how did it enrich you, or what it gave you, you know, what are your memories of your role and your time with Radio Free Europe?
It's eerily similar to Tom's, despite the fact that we were separated, I think, by many years. Tom, when I first met him in Washington, as I took on the job, actually previewed for me what the job would be like very effectively, and he was right. And although I was only there 10.5 months, and I hope it's not the most glorious 10.5 months in my life, because I've got hopefully much more of my life ahead of me, but I would say the same thing right now is the highlight of my career thus far. And it's all because of the people, which Tom eloquently described. People who get up every morning with that sole objective of telling the truth, of sharing news and information with their fellow countrymen and women that they can't find elsewhere. A lot of the journalists, especially those out in the bureaus, who are doing that under great duress, under risk to themselves, to their families, not because they're paid well, unfortunately, and just working side by side with those people on a daily basis. That's the beauty of leading RFERL. The other thing I'll just note too, which I guess I didn't maybe realize when I took the job, was just the loyalty and the legacy of those 70 years that still resonate with so many people who are alive today. I would meet people who would tell me stories about their grandparents listening to the radios, people my age who also were emotional about the radios just because of the stories they had heard from their families, foreign leaders I would meet with who would tear up as they described to me their personal stories listening to the radios, and average citizens that I would meet when I visited the bureaus, our current audience, who still had this passionate loyalty for the mission. Those were all incredibly inspiring aspects of leading RFERL. And so, you know, it's I think probably one of the best jobs there is for those of us who care about democracy and human rights.
Amy Fly, Tom Dine, gentlemen, I thank you very much for your time. I thank you for your knowledge and for the memories you shared with us on this very important anniversary for 70th anniversary of establishment of Radio Free Europe. Thank you very much for your time. And I also thank you very much to all the audience and all the people who listen to us and for the very good and relevant questions. Thank you very much, and you have a good rest of the day now.
Pleasure. Thank you.